The orchestra had not yet finished its final flourish when the scandal detonated across the Earl of Westmere's ballroom, not with noise, but with the sharp, merciless silence that follows a collective gasp. Lady Eleanor Ashford felt that silence strike like a blade, cold and unsparing, carving through the fragile dignity she had managed to carry into the evening. She had come prepared to smile, to greet, to pretend that her family's fortunes had not been dwindling for years. She had not come prepared to witness the man she was to marry lift another woman's hand with the tender reverence he had never once shown her. William Hargrove bent low over Lady Clarissa Norwood's gloved fingers, the gesture far too intimate to be misunderstood, and Clarissa, radiant in pearls Eleanor could never afford, accepted the attention with a coy tilt of her head. The sight landed with cruel clarity. Guests paused mid-conversation, fans froze mid-sweep, one violinist faltered, drawing a note so sour that even those determined to ignore the unfolding disgrace could not pretend it away. Eleanor stood rooted, unable to trust her breath. She had feared William's wavering interest for months, but fear was nothing compared to this public unraveling. Her father pressed a trembling hand to her back. "Keep your poise, my dear," he whispered, but his voice wavered under the weight of their shared humiliation. Eleanor nodded, though her throat tightened painfully. She wished desperately for escape, a corridor, a courtyard, anything that did not burn with watchful eyes, but she forced herself to step forward with deliberate grace. She demanded an explanation, the soft strength of her voice belying the storm rising inside her. William straightened, annoyance flickering across his handsome features. "Eleanor, this is neither the time nor the place." "It seems precisely both," she replied, holding his gaze though her lungs fought for air. "You were to escort me this evening. Instead, you make a spectacle that invites the worst conclusions." Clarissa's smirk was slight but vicious. William's lips tightened, and he lowered his voice. "Your expectations are unreasonable. Circumstances have changed. Our union no longer aligns with my interests, or your family's position." The cruelty of it struck harder than the betrayal itself. William no longer bothered with courtesy. Eleanor's family's decline was an open secret, but to wield it as justification for discarding her, here before half of London society, was an act of calculated humiliation. She felt the edges of her composure fray. "You gave me your word," she whispered. He shrugged lightly as though promises were trifles. "A man cannot bind himself to failing prospects. Clarissa's father offers opportunities one cannot ignore." He glanced at Clarissa, whose triumphant gaze glittered. Eleanor's stomach clenched. She turned away before her restraint shattered. But as she did, another presence entered the periphery of her vision. The Duke of Ravensshire, notorious for his reserve, revered for his influence, stood at a distance, observing the scene with unreadable calm. His dark attire rendered him almost statuesque, a silent sentinel to her unraveling. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and in his she found not pity, but something far more unsettling, recognition, as though he understood the precise shape of her pain. Eleanor's father approached the Duke in quiet desperation, and she felt her breath falter anew. A political marriage. A desperate solution. A lifeline wrapped in iron. The Duke listened to her father's whispered plea, his expression carved from stillness. When he finally inclined his head, it was with the solemn gravity of a verdict delivered. Eleanor felt the ground tilt beneath her. She accepted the proposal because pride demanded she not remain the object of whispers. She accepted because heartbreak had hollowed her, leaving no room for dreams. She accepted because the alternative, remaining William's discarded shadow, was unbearable. As arrangements were whispered, William glanced in her direction, a flicker of surprise crossing his arrogant composure. Yet Eleanor did not look away. She let him see the steel rising beneath the bruised layers of her heart. She would not crumble for the sake of a man who had traded affection for advantage. The Duke approached her father with measured steps, offering formal assurances about stability, alliance, and discretion. Eleanor listened, numb but attentive. When he finally addressed her, his voice was lower than she expected, steady as winter rain. "Lady Eleanor, I offer no false promises. This union will serve mutual necessity. Yet I give you my word you will never be made a spectacle under my name." The words, simple yet sincere, struck deeper than William's broken vows. She inclined her head in acceptance, though the motion felt distant, as though her own body moved without her. The ballroom seemed to shrink and swell around her, its gilded splendor suffocating rather than grand. But beneath the suffocation lingered something else, a fragile clarity. Her path was altered, yes, but not ended. As she stepped toward the waiting carriage that would carry her from the ruins of her former hopes, she allowed herself one final glance back at the ballroom where her heart had been shattered. William stood with Clarissa draped possessively at his side, but the triumph on their faces no longer pierced her. What lingered instead was a whisper of resolve. The Duke watched her from the threshold, his expression unreadable but not cold. In his stillness she sensed an unexpected steadiness, a quietness that did not mirror indifference but something more intricate, something she did not yet have the strength to name. She climbed into the carriage, the door closing with a soft thud that echoed far too loudly in her chest. As the wheels began to turn, carrying her into a future forged from necessity rather than affection, a single thought surfaced with surprising force. Perhaps the most devastating endings were merely the disguised beginnings of something wholly unforeseen. And though she dared not hope for tenderness from a man known for political severity, the faintest warmth stirred in her chest as she recalled the gravity in his voice. She did not yet understand why his gaze had lingered on her grief, or why it had steadied her when all else failed. But she would soon learn that the coldest reputations often concealed the most unyielding devotion, and that her story, far from ending in ruin, had only just begun. Trouble announced itself the moment Eleanor crossed the threshold of Ravensshire estate, not with fanfare but with the unsettling stillness that follows an unspoken warning. A hushed tension clung to the air, as though the walls themselves held their breath for her arrival. Servants dipped subtle bows yet exchanged uneasy glances behind her back, offering respect laced with a curiosity that bordered on alarm. It struck Eleanor that her marriage, hurried and whispered about with ruthless precision, had reached the house before she had. Yet amid the tension stood the Duke himself, not at the grand staircase as tradition dictated, but at the far end of the entrance hall, half-shadowed as though unwilling to overwhelm her with spectacle. His posture was straight, almost austere, but there was something measured in his gaze, something careful, deliberate, and disarmingly human. "Duchess," he greeted, the title falling with unexpected warmth, as though he wished to reassure her without encroaching upon her shaken pride. Eleanor curtsied with graceful restraint, though the rapid beat beneath her ribs betrayed the strain of her composure. She had braced herself for cold indifference, for a man sculpted entirely from political purpose, and yet the quiet sincerity in his voice unsettled her expectations more than any frost could have. He offered his arm, not as command but invitation, and she accepted because retreat would have felt like surrender. The house, vast and dignified, seemed to observe the newly joined pair with cautious appraisal as they walked deeper into its heart. Eleanor noted the faint scent of polished wood, the distant murmur of servants, the restrained elegance woven into every corner. It was a world far removed from the crumbling familiarity of her childhood home. But the grandeur did nothing to quiet the ache clinging to her like a shadow. When they reached her appointed chambers, Eleanor paused, taken aback by the fire already glowing in the hearth. Someone had anticipated the chill of her arrival, a thoughtful gesture too intimate to attribute to chance. Beside the mantel lay a small bouquet, modest, not extravagant, made of the same white heather her mother once favored. Eleanor's breath wavered, memories pressed forward, soft and aching. The Duke watched her reaction with the quiet attentiveness of a man accustomed to reading what others tried to hide. "The housekeeper informs me you prefer simplicity," he said softly, "so I instructed the staff to avoid unnecessary ornament." His restraint was disarming. Nothing about him sought to claim or impress her, and that gentle distance made her feel seen rather than scrutinized. Eleanor thanked him with careful poise, yet her heart flickered with confusion, for this quiet courtesy felt wholly unlike the cold, strategic union she had braced herself to endure. She had imagined icy indifference, a life lived beside a stranger, but the man before her seemed determined to grant her dignity where others had stripped it away. Still, the world beyond Ravensshire was not ready to grant her such mercy. By morning, London's whispers had already reached the estate, carried by the ruthless channels of gossip that outpaced even the swiftest messenger. A footman, flustered, presented the Duke with a newspaper whose ink seemed barely dry. Eleanor saw the tension stiffen Adrian's jaw before he handed it to her in silence. The headline, bold and merciless, cut through her like a blade: "The Duke's Charity, a fallen lady finds convenient shelter." Heat surged behind her eyes, but she forced herself to breathe, refusing to grant the writer the satisfaction of her despair. Adrian's voice, usually composed, held an undercurrent of something fierce. "This is slander," he said, "and it will be answered." Eleanor shook her head, not in dismissal but weary understanding. "It is the price of public ruin," she murmured. "They smell weakness and they feast upon it." But Adrian stepped closer, not invading her space, merely anchoring the distance between them with quiet resolve. "Let them feast," he replied. "They will choke on their arrogance soon enough." Eleanor studied him, startled by the controlled fire beneath his calm exterior. This was not a man indifferent to her suffering. This was a man who would not stand idle while others sought to break her further. For the first time, she felt the faint flicker of safety, fragile yet undeniably present. Later that afternoon, as sunlight thinned across the corridor floors, Eleanor found a folded note slipped beneath her door, written in the Duke's precise hand. There were only 7 words, but they steadied something deep within her. "You owe no person your silence now." She pressed the note to her palm, startled by how profoundly she needed such a simple mercy. But mercy, she soon discovered, was rarely granted without cost. A carriage arrived at dusk, bearing a messenger from London with tidings sharp enough to slice through the fragile calm she had built within the estate walls. Eleanor unfolded the sealed parchment, and as her eyes traced the ink, the remnants of her composure faltered. William Hargrove, it declared, sought an audience, to discuss unfinished matters of the heart. Her pulse lurched, not with longing but with a visceral dread that crawled beneath her skin. She had not expected William to retreat gracefully, yet she had hoped he would at least allow her the dignity of distance. Instead, his request clawed open wounds she had only begun to seal. She read the message twice, then a third time, each repetition tightening the grip of old memories she wished to forget. His careless laughter, his shifting affections, the quiet way he had eroded her confidence long before he destroyed her reputation. The room seemed to tilt as she lowered the parchment. It was not love that returned to haunt her, it was humiliation wearing the mask of sentiment. Before she could gather her breath, a knock sounded at her door, measured, unmistakably the Duke's. Eleanor straightened, aware that whatever lay in her expression might reveal more than she wished. When she opened the door, Adrian stood with a steady gaze that seemed to read the letter in her hand without needing to look at it. A restrained tension flickered in his eyes, not anger but something sharper, protective. In that quiet corridor, she sensed the truth with clarity. The past she thought buried was rising again, and it would not rise. Calamity struck in the most unexpected form, not with raised voices or clashing tempers, but with the soft, devastating crack of something inside Eleanor finally giving way. The letter from William lay on her desk like a dormant serpent, its ink deceptively gentle while its intent coiled with venom. She had spent the early hours of the evening pacing her chamber, trying to quiet the tremor in her breath, but the past had a way of slipping through even the smallest fractures of her composure. When the Duke knocked upon her door, the sound echoed through her like the toll of a distant bell summoning her to a reckoning she had hoped to avoid. Adrian stepped inside only when she granted permission, his restraint a comfort she had not anticipated needing. He observed her with a calm intensity, as though assessing the gravity of the storm shifting behind her eyes. She held the letter tightly, crumpling its edge in her grasp. He did not reach for it, nor did he press her to speak before she was ready. Instead, he offered the steady quiet of a man who understood the value of silence. For a moment, Eleanor wished the world could mirror that silence, that it might still itself long enough for her to gather breath and reason. "William has written," she finally murmured, her voice thinner than intended. Adrian's eyes cooled, though not with anger toward her. "He seeks to unsettle you," he said. "He understands the power of old wounds." His certainty sent a ripple through her. She had not expected him to name the truth so plainly. She had grown used to men who veiled cruelty in polite phrases. The Duke offered clarity without bitterness, a rare honesty that felt almost protective. Eleanor lowered her gaze. "He requests an audience." She attempted steadiness, but her fingers trembled around the paper. "He claims unfinished matters of the heart." The Duke's jaw tightened, the movement subtle yet unmistakably forged from tempered steel. "Do you wish to meet him?" he asked. His expression remained controlled, but something beneath it flickered. Fear of her answer, or fear of what? The answer might cost her. Eleanor inhaled slowly. "I do not wish to," she confessed. "But I fear refusal may invite new cruelty." Adrian stepped closer only when he sensed she would not retreat, his presence settling around her like a shield rather than a snare. "He forfeited all claim to your time, your dignity, and your heart," he said quietly. "You owe him nothing." The conviction in his words unraveled something in her chest. She had long believed that suffering was to be endured silently, that dignity meant swallowing pain until one could no longer taste its bitterness. Yet here stood a man who insisted she deserved freedom from torment. The realization struck her with unexpected force. Her breath wavered. "If I meet him, it must not be here." Ravenshair should not bear the stain of his presence. Adrian nodded, his gaze softening with understanding. Then choose a place where you command the terms. She hesitated. A public garden, she said, where propriety and witness will restrain him. He inclined his head. Then I will arrange for a carriage at dawn. Their eyes held, and for a moment Eleanor felt an inexplicable shift, subtle, fragile, but undeniably real. It was not closeness, not affection, but a quiet recognition that she was no longer navigating heartbreak alone. Adrian's voice gentled. If he harms you with words, you may tell me. I will answer whatever injustice he attempts. Eleanor shook her head. You need not involve yourself. He held her gaze. I am already involved. The simplicity of that truth struck her harder than any grand declaration could have. She looked away before the warmth rising beneath her breastbone became too visible. The next morning dawned thin and pale, the air crisp enough to bite. Eleanor arrived at the appointed garden wrapped in measured composure, though her stomach coiled with unease. William waited near a wrought-iron bench, his posture casual, as though their last meeting had not ended with her reputation in ruins. The sight of him, so familiar, yet so painfully distant from who she had once believed him to be, sent a cold shock through her. He greeted her with a smile practiced to counterfeit remorse. Eleanor, you look pale, he said. I feared our abrupt parting wounded you. She lifted her chin. Your concern is belated. He winced, then attempted charm. My father pressured me. Circumstances shifted. You must understand. I understand only that you chose convenience over loyalty, she replied steadily, and that you exposed me to ridicule without hesitation. His smile faltered. But you are a duchess now. Surely you see the irony, my folly elevated you. The audacity of his claim stunned her. You did not elevate me, she said quietly. You freed me from the illusion that you were worthy of the devotion I offered. William's expression hardened, his charm dissolving. The Duke is a cold man. Do you imagine he will care for you? You were a symbol to him, nothing more. Eleanor's breath caught, not in doubt but in realization. She had once trembled under such insinuations, but the memory of Adrian's steady presence eclipsed William's poisonous certainty. Whatever he is, she said, he treats me with more integrity than you ever did. William's eyes sharpened with a wounded arrogance. You speak boldly for someone who once adored me. She shook her head. I adored the man I thought you were. You cured me of that illusion. For a moment, William faltered and the mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine regret tangled with pride. But it was too late. Eleanor turned away, her decision made not from bitterness but from clarity. As she walked back toward the waiting carriage, she felt something shift within her, an emancipation from the weight of what once was. Yet when she stepped inside, her breath stilled. Adrian sat across from her, waiting silently, his expression unreadable. Eleanor froze, the implications colliding with her still racing heartbeat. You came, she whispered, unsure whether it was accusation or relief. Adrian held her gaze with quiet intensity. I had to know, he said softly, whether your past still held the power to claim you. The carriage jolted forward, and the world beyond its windows blurred, leaving Eleanor suspended between the remnants of her grief and the startling possibility emerging in the space between them. The scandal arrived not with drums, nor the whisper of rumor, but with the cold, precise certainty of a man who believed he could still claim what he had once abandoned. William Hargrove, pale in the late afternoon light, waited in the garden as though the hours of distance and humiliation had absolved him of his past cruelty. Eleanor's carriage drew to a measured halt, the wheels crunching on the gravel with an almost ritualistic finality. She stepped down with the poise of a duchess, yet her chest tightened, her hands pressing instinctively to the folds of her gown. Every instinct screamed retreat, yet she walked forward, compelled by the desire to face the final remnant of her former life before she could allow herself to live fully in the present. William's smile was a practiced arch, his eyes glinting with the familiarity that had once entranced her, and Eleanor felt the old ache stir, only to push it away with deliberate force. Eleanor, he began, voice low and insistent, I realize my errors now. I was blind to the fortune that lay in your heart, and she held up a gloved hand, halting his rehearsed apology. You have had your time to speak, William. Your words now cannot undo the humiliation you inflicted nor the trust you squandered. He faltered, genuinely surprised by the sharpness in her tone. He caught himself. I am merely asking for an audience to offer reparation. Eleanor shook her head, the autumn wind tossing a strand of her dark hair across her face. You offer nothing. You cannot repair what was broken before, and even if you could, I would not accept it. Each word fell with measured precision, designed not to wound but to sever. William's eyes darkened, a flare of frustration and something unspoken, regret perhaps but tangled with pride, painting his features. The garden itself seemed to hold its breath. Ornamental hedges, clipped with fastidious care, framed the tense tableau. The fountains whispered their liquid cadence, indifferent to human turmoil. Eleanor felt the past and present collide, her dignity standing like a fragile crystal against the force of old betrayal. "The Duke," she said at last, steadying herself, "is a man of honor. He protects me in ways you never imagined possible." William's brow twitched. "The Duke?" he asked, venom and disbelief mingling. "Do you truly suppose that he, or any man, would care for you so sincerely?" Eleanor's gaze hardened, her voice carrying a quiet fire that William could neither disarm nor deflect. "He does not, suppose. He acts. And his actions speak more eloquently than your empty declarations ever could." A silence fell, one weighted with the gravity of choices long past and consequences freshly realized. William's mouth opened, then closed, a futile effort to reclaim words she no longer wished to hear. Eleanor turned away from him, walking toward the stone balustrade that overlooked the estate's northern lawns, each step deliberate, each heartbeat a drum of resolve. Adrian appeared then, as though summoned by some unspoken signal, emerging from the shadowed path behind the hedges. His presence was immediate, commanding, yet tempered with a careful restraint that betrayed the depth of his vigilance. Eleanor felt the tension ease slightly, not for lack of fear, but because the man who had stood quietly beside her grief now stood beside her in the shadow of confrontation. Adrian's dark eyes met William's, unflinching, and in that gaze lay the authority of a man unwilling to allow injustice to pass unchallenged. The air shifted, even the leaves seemed to pause. William attempted to smile, but it faltered under Adrian's scrutiny. "You presume to dictate the terms of her life?" he asked, his voice attempting bravado but quivering at the edges. Adrian inclined his head slightly, measured, each word deliberate. "I do not dictate her life, Mr. Hargrove. I honor it. And I do not permit insults to her person or reputation, regardless of past familiarity." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She had not expected Adrian to confront William with such controlled power. The reminder of his unwavering support stilled the lingering tremor in her chest. She had long feared that the man who once betrayed her would cast shadows upon her present, yet here was a steadfast presence, shielding her with quiet authority. William, recognizing that confrontation could not be won by argument, attempted a final appeal to sentiment. "Eleanor, consider the years we might have shared." Eleanor raised her hand again. "Consider nothing. I have already considered all that matters. I choose my life now, and my choices do not include you." The words rang like chimes in the chilled air, each one deliberate, each one severing the threads of a past she had once clung to in trembling hope. William's lips pressed into a thin line, a subtle mixture of anger and awe, before he finally turned, defeated not by force but by the unassailable clarity of her resolve. With William's departure, the wind seemed to exhale, carrying away the tension that had suffused the garden. Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly, not from weakness, but from the relief that the confrontation was over, that the ghosts of betrayal no longer claimed dominion over her spirit. She turned to Adrian, finding him still standing at a careful distance, hands clasped behind his back, expression calm yet alive with unspoken intensity. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of gratitude, relief and newfound respect. "For everything." Adrian inclined his head, but did not step closer, respecting the space she needed even as his eyes betrayed the depth of his concern. "It is never a question of thanks, Eleanor. You deserve dignity. Always." The atmosphere shifted, charged with a different energy, more intimate than any display of public favor or ceremonial attention could provide. Eleanor realized, with an almost terrifying clarity, that the life she had feared, a life of strategic alliances and dutiful appearances, might contain moments of genuine affection, moments carved not from necessity but from choice. Adrian's measured proximity, his subtle attentiveness, suggested a devotion that was quiet yet unyielding, a tether she had never anticipated but instinctively understood. That evening the estate's great hall welcomed her with a soft hush of candlelight and muted warmth. Servants moved with practiced discretion, and the faint scent of lavender and polished wood lingered in the air, a contrast to the cold rigidity of her earlier encounter. Eleanor took her place among the shadows and flickering light, acutely aware of the subtle tension that still hummed beneath the surface of her world. Adrian stood nearby, ever watchful, though the rigid armor of his composure did not betray the careful attention he paid to her movements, her expressions, her unspoken moods. In him, she saw the first true embodiment of safety since her humiliation had begun, a consistency that did not demand anything but existed to protect. As the night wore on, whispers of society's curiosity and speculation began to thread their way into the hall, tentative and intrusive. Eleanor noted them with detached amusement, recognizing that the judgment of others no longer carried the power it once had over her. Where once she might have faltered beneath the scrutiny of observers, she now moved with measured grace, her steps deliberate, her gaze steady. Adrian's presence beside her was a silent acknowledgement that she no longer needed to navigate the world alone. Each glance, each subtle gesture, conveyed a loyalty and awareness that reassured her more than words ever could. Yet even as comfort settled upon her, Eleanor could not ignore the quiet pulse of tension that persisted, the delicate undercurrent of uncertainty that reminded her that life, even at its most promising, was never without shadow. She knew William's intrusion had been only the first wave of past ties attempting to reclaim their hold. She also knew that Adrian's unwavering devotion, while protective, was a bond yet to be tested against the currents of society and the pressures of their shared station. The realization sent a shiver through her, not of fear but of anticipation, for she understood that the story of her heart was only beginning to unfold, and that the next chapters would demand courage, discernment, and the quiet fortitude that she had begun to cultivate. As the candles burned low, casting elongated shadows across the polished floors and gilded walls, Eleanor found herself standing at the window, gazing toward the distant horizon where the gardens met the fading twilight. The memory of William's plea lingered, but it had lost its power over her. She inhaled deeply, allowing the cool night air to fill her lungs and steady her heartbeat. Beside her, Adrian's presence remained constant, silent yet profoundly anchoring, a reminder that some forms of devotion needed no flourish, no declaration, only the steadfastness of being there when it mattered most. The soft, lingering warmth of trust settled in Eleanor's chest, an unfamiliar but welcome companion. She realized that the choice she had made, choosing her dignity, her present, and the quiet guidance of a man who genuinely respected her, was not merely a reaction to past betrayal, but an active step toward the life she deserved. And yet, as the moon cast its silver light across the estate, painting the gardens and terraces with a serene glow, Eleanor understood that even in moments of triumph, the world outside waited, full of scrutiny and challenge, ready to test the fragile piece she had carved. Her gaze shifted to Adrian, standing just beyond the window's frame, his expression unreadable but his attention entirely hers. The weight of the evening, the confrontation, and the realization of her own strength converged in that quiet space. For the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to consider that love, even in its most measured form, could exist alongside resilience, dignity, and self-possession. And in that thought, the faintest spark of hope took root, fragile yet unyielding, promising that the chapters yet to come might be written not with fear but with choice. But before that future could fully unfold, a whisper of uncertainty reached her, a letter delivered to Adrian's study during the evening's quiet, carried by a messenger whose hurried pace betrayed urgency. Eleanor's gaze flickered toward him as he broke the seal and read its contents, the brief tightening of his jaw the only outward sign of the storm concealed within. The letter's presence, unexplained yet foreboding, cast a subtle shadow across the fragile calm that had settled over her heart. She felt it keenly. The next chapter would arrive not as a gentle continuation, but as a challenge to every ounce of dignity, courage, and trust she had claimed. The summons arrived with no warning, a single sheet of parchment bearing the royal seal that seemed to thrum with authority. Eleanor held it in trembling hands, the edges crisp, the ink dark against pale paper, and felt the world shift beneath her once more. The monarchy required their presence at court. Adrian, standing nearby, had already broken the seal and read the brief instructions. His brow tightened, the first sign of worry Eleanor had seen in days. "They request our attendance," he said, voice calm but taut. "The matter concerns the stability of certain alliances, and your presence is expected alongside mine." Eleanor's chest constricted, but she straightened her shoulders, aware that the role she occupied now demanded both composure and courage. By the time they arrived at the palace, the afternoon sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the marble courtyard. The carriage doors opened with a muted flourish, and Eleanor stepped onto the stones, acutely aware of the throng of courtiers whose eyes lingered with curiosity, some with suspicion. Whispers drifted across the polished corridors as they passed, quick and sharp. "The Duchess Ashford, she speaks for herself now? And the Duke's new wife seems unafraid." Eleanor's pulse surged, a mix of anxiety and resolve. She had walked through judgment before, but this was different. Here, at the heart of power, her dignity, intelligence, and newfound authority would be tested not in whispers, but in the piercing scrutiny of the Crown and Parliament. Adrian's hand brushed hers ever so lightly as they entered the chamber. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, yet it grounded her in ways words never could. She glanced at him and his eyes met hers, steady and reassuring, carrying a quiet message. You are not alone. Eleanor drew a slow breath and stepped forward. The chamber's hush seemed to widen the space around her, yet she felt no emptiness, only a sharp awareness of every moment, every word yet to be spoken. The assembly began with formality, the Duke responding to ceremonial questions with the precise balance of authority and diplomacy expected of his station. When the discussion turned to matters touching alliances, Eleanor felt a surge of instinct, a clarity that could not be ignored. She had observed, she had listened, she had learned the subtleties of the intricate dance of nobility and power. When a counselor attempted to challenge her knowledge of certain regional matters, she did not falter. Her voice, soft but unwavering, carried through the chamber with clarity. If I may, the needs of the northern estates would benefit more from collaboration than edict. The people's welfare must be our guiding principle, and expediency alone serves neither crown nor country. The room shifted. Heads turned, surprise lingered like a tangible thing. Even Adrian's lips curved in subtle approval, though he remained composed, ever the protector of propriety. Whispers echoed in corners, muted yet relentless. Eleanor could feel the scrutiny, yet she stood unshaken, rooted by something more powerful than fear or expectation. She stood anchored in self-respect, in the knowledge that she was no longer defined by past humiliations. Each sentence she spoke carried the weight of experience, of betrayal endured, and of the quiet strength she had cultivated. By the time the discussion drew to a close, murmurs had shifted, the tone altered by recognition of her insight and authority. What had begun as a summons fraught with tension ended with a room silently acknowledging her worth. Later, in the quiet of a lantern-lit corridor, Adrian's hand found hers once more, this time with deliberate intention. Eleanor allowed herself to meet his gaze fully, the flicker of candlelight illuminating the dark planes of his face, softening the stern lines that so often defined him. You have no idea how extraordinary you are, he said, voice low, meant only for her. You stood before power itself and did not bend. I have seen many courts, many faces, many words, but I have never witnessed courage such as yours. Eleanor felt warmth rise, a fragile ember kindling in her chest. She had expected praise perhaps, but not this recognition of her strength as a person, not merely a title. She responded with measured honesty, her voice steady yet soft. I could not have done it without knowing you would be beside me, even in silence. Your presence, it steadied me. Adrian's hand tightened slightly around hers, and in that subtle pressure, she understood the depth of his devotion. It was not the overt flourish of dramatic affection, but the quiet constancy that mattered far more, the unwavering support that allowed her dignity to flourish where others might have tried to diminish it. That evening, as the carriage returned them to Ravensshire estate, the gardens bathed in the muted silver of early moonlight, Eleanor allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The events of the past weeks, the betrayal, the confrontation with William, the careful, unassuming loyalty of Adrian, had shifted something within her. She felt lighter, as though the burdens of shame had been lifted from her shoulders, leaving space for something entirely new, trust, hope, and the slow, insistent stirrings of love. Upon returning to the estate, Adrian walked beside her along the quiet paths lined with clipped hedges, the lanterns casting pools of golden light. Eleanor felt the crisp evening air settle around her, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the gardens, and allowed herself to look fully at the man who had transformed her fear into security, her doubt into clarity. Eleanor, Adrian began, voice low, yet imbued with an emotion carefully restrained, I have waited, perhaps longer than I should have, to say what I feel. I cannot promise that all days will be without challenge, but I can promise that I will always protect you, honor you, and cherish the life we choose together. Eleanor's breath caught, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had not anticipated words so forthright, nor the quiet majesty of a declaration born not of vanity or conquest, but of genuine devotion. Adrian, she whispered, voice trembling only slightly, you offer me more than I ever believed possible, respect, patience, and loyalty. I have feared love because it can wound so deeply, but with you I feel something else entirely, a courage to hope, to trust, to live. He drew closer, the distance between them measured but intentional. The moonlight caught the faintest glint of emotion in his eyes, and Eleanor felt a deep, unspoken connection, a bond forged not in spectacle or sentiment, but in shared experience and quiet understanding. He did not rush, did not claim her with force, but held her presence as though it were precious and fragile. She responded in kind, allowing her hand to rest lightly against his, the warmth of their palms bridging the space between them, steady and tender. In that moment, Eleanor realized that the tumult of her past, the betrayal, the whispers of society, the relentless expectation of propriety, no longer held dominion over her. She had emerged from those trials not merely intact, but strengthened, her dignity intact, her heart cautiously open. And beside her stood a man whose devotion was steadfast, whose presence affirmed her worth, whose care for her transcended the political convenience that had begun their union. As the evening deepened, the estate's lanterns casting elongated shadows across the gravel paths, Adrian spoke once more, a quiet certainty in his tone. "Eleanor, you are my choice, not duty, not strategy, but a choice I make every day. Your courage, your grace, and your heart are what I cherish most." She looked up at him, the moonlight illuminating her eyes, shimmering with tears that were not sorrow but the profound relief of recognition and acceptance. "And you are the man I never believed I deserved," she said softly. The words hung between them, fragile yet resolute, carrying the weight of truth, the promise of partnership, and the beginnings of something enduring. The night embraced them with the gentle hush of wind through the gardens, a soft prelude to the life they would build together. Eleanor allowed herself to lean into the quiet certainty of his presence. The unspoken vows carried not in ceremony but in steadfast devotion. For the first time since betrayal had shattered her world, she felt the steady rhythm of hope, the surety that love, true and measured, could coexist with dignity and strength. Yet even as the moment settled, Eleanor sensed the whisper of what was to come, a world beyond the gardens, beyond the estate, still observant, still watchful. She understood that while her heart had found safety, the path ahead would require vigilance, courage, and the same unwavering commitment she had demanded of herself. With Adrian beside her, however, she knew that no challenge, no whisper, and no shadow could diminish what they had begun to build together. The soft lantern light fell upon them, mingling with the moon's silver glow, and Eleanor allowed a rare smile to bloom, tentative yet radiant. In the quiet of the estate, amid the enduring beauty of the gardens and the constancy of Adrian's presence, she found a truth she had long sought, that love could heal without possession, that loyalty could coexist with independence, and that devotion, quiet yet profound, could redefine the course of a life once shattered. As they stood together beneath the silvered trees, hand in hand, Eleanor whispered, almost to herself, "Perhaps the world's judgment can never undo the heart's quiet truths." Adrian's gaze met hers, unwavering, and the moment stretched, delicate and eternal, a promise that the trials behind them had forged a foundation for all the days yet to come. And somewhere, in the silence that followed, Eleanor felt the faintest flutter of anticipation for the life they would shape together, unbroken and steadfast as the night deepened around them.